Well, hey, and welcome to our Wednesday night Christian Chapel Bible study. Glad you could tune in and be with us tonight. Jesus was approachable. He was approachable by any person, anybody. And the religious group of that day, the Pharisees, had a problem with Jesus hanging out with sinners. I guess they thought, hey, if you're really a deity, if you're really God's son, why are you hanging out with all these people that are sinful, tax collectors and prostitutes, and those people that just seem to be the undesirables, if you will. Jesus, I think, could definitely identify with the sinful folks in this world, and because he loved them. Now, the problem for many of us today is we really don't have a problem identifying with the world. It seems like we have a problem being different than the world. We must never try to escape from the truth that there is a fundamental difference between Christians and non-Christians. Now, we should not be in the business of snubbing people. As a matter of fact, we should be in the business of loving people. But I want you to listen to what Paul said in Romans 12, verse 2. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Paul says these words, "And do not be conformed to this world, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and the perfect will of God." And I think the key here is when Paul tells us, do not be conformed to this world. So yes, I believe God is calling us to be different. There are some ways that we are called to be different, and I think Jesus outlined a lot of these in his Sermon on the Mount. Number one, a Christian's character must be different. A Christian's character must be different. In Jesus' opening comments in his Sermon on the Mount, we call these the Beatitudes. Jesus said that some of the character traits that we should have is that we should hunger and thirst after righteousness, after that which is right. He said we should be pure in heart. We should be merciful. We should be peacemakers. Our character must be different than the character of the world. We're called, first of all, to have a different character. Secondly, I believe a Christian's influence must be different. Jesus said this, again in his Sermon on the Mount. He says that we must be like a light, like sitting on a hill. We must be shining forth the goodness of God. Our influence must be that of light rather than darkness. He said we're called to be the salt of the earth. And he didn't necessarily mention this, but I think another thing he could have meant there is we're also called to be some sugar. We need to be a little bit of sugar every now and then too. Our influence must be different. Thirdly, a Christian's righteousness must be different. In Matthew chapter 5, again in the Sermon on the Mount, especially in verses 17 through 42, Jesus calls us to morality, not to immorality, but he calls us to morality. He has some very strong things to say about being moral. He has some very strong things to say about a Christian's morality in relationships with one another. He says your righteousness can't be like that of the world. It must be different. We must be a moral people. A fourth thing that I think Jesus points out in the Sermon on the Mount is that our piety must be different. Our piety must be different. We're not called to be a pious people. I want you to listen to these words from Matthew chapter 6. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Surely I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. What is Jesus trying to tell us in these verses? I think he's trying to say that we must move from being superficial into people who are deeply devoted, who are real. I think he's calling us to be real, not over religious. Sometimes, and I'm going to say this, sometimes people are so religious you can't hardly stand to be around them. He hadn't called us to be that religious. He's called us to be devoted. He's called us to be real, everyday Christians who are different, who think differently, who act differently. Our piety, we can't be a pious people. We can't have these bloated egos and arrogance. We must understand that God has called us to be the light and the salt and the sugar of the world. And then fifthly, I believe a Christian's ambitions must be different. I think Jesus is calling us to understand that our ambitions must be different. In Matthew chapter 6, again, verses 19 through 34, Jesus reminds us that possessions, the things we own, wealth, money, all of these are temporary. They're temporary. Who was it that said they've never seen a hearse with a U-Haul behind it? We can't take it with us. Jesus wants us to understand how the things of the materialistic things of this world are temporary. Our ambitions must be different. Our sight, our love. Jesus said, whatever you treasure, that's where your heart's going to be. Our treasure, our love must be in that which is eternal, in Jesus Christ, and the things we do for him that will last a lifetime. That'll be for all of eternity. Our ambitions must be different. Then number 6, I believe Christ is trying to tell us that our relationship must be different. We have to look at relationships with a different mindset. In Matthew chapter 5, and I'll begin with verse 43, it says this: "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." That's hard. That's hard stuff. This is not milk right here. This is meat. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? What reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Even the tax collectors do so. Therefore, you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Jesus is calling us to have a different mindset when it comes to our relationship with other people. And then finally, Jesus tells us, number 7, that our commitment must be different. Our commitment to him must be different. Listen to what he says in Matthew 7, beginning with verse 21, as he starts to come to the end of his sermon. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" Our commitment must be different. It must be something that more than something we say. The Lord told us one time in his word, he said, you honor me with your lips, you worship me with your lips, but your heart is far away from me. Our commitment must be different. We must love the Lord with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we must be about the business of doing the will of our Father. Jesus welcomed and loved sinners. Thank God. Aren't you glad of that? He never drove them away. He never pushed them away. He showed genuine compassion to all people. But he was also direct and uncompromising in denouncing sin. Jesus had compassion, but there was also a toughness in his love. Jesus won people without sacrificing the purity of his life. If Jesus is our Lord, our compassion will be shaped by his moral absolutes. Sometimes the enemy of our age is to be too tolerant, and too open-minded, because sometimes when we are so open-minded about everything, sometimes when we're so open-minded, our brain falls out. We don't think anymore. We don't reason. We don't pray anymore about the things that we should be doing. Holiness never abandons. Holiness never abandons. It identifies deeply with people, but it also brings the reality of God's presence and the purity of his holiness. Am I different? Am I different from the world? That's a question that I think we should continuously ask ourselves. And remember the words of Paul when he said, "Now, do not be conformed to this world." God's not called us to be like this world. He's called us to love it, to witness, to share our love, to share our compassion, to share our witness, to share our light, to share our salt, to share our sugar. But he's never called us to be like the world. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We should think about this a lot. We should renew our minds every day by the renewal of your mind to do that which is good and perfect and that which is the will of God. Yes, we must be in the world, but we can't afford to be of the world. We are called to be different in our character, in our influence, in our righteousness, not to be so pious that we're no good. Our ambitions must be different, our relationships must be different, and our commitment must be genuine, and it must be real. Do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind to do that which is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. God bless you, and I hope to see you Sunday.